Hey guys, this is the Knowledge Book Club, our first book. We're start with why. Chapters 1 through 4 we'll be discussing with Jonathan here, and we'll be going over some interesting topics and
What's good?
stuff we came up with along the way during our conversation. Do you want to start with your first question?
Absolutely. So at the end of this, we're going to go over the other 4 questions that we talked about, kind of trying to still organize and see how we're going to lay this entire, I don't want to call it a fiasco, but that's what it kind of feels like sometimes, how we're going to lay this all out. But honestly, as I want to cover, like the first thing, as I started reading this book, I thought it was going to be presented completely different. Like the first chapter, Assume You Know, I thought that it was going to be about people talking about their internal selves and how they how they look at the world, but legitimately it's all about business. And so I was kind of thrown back at first because I'm listening to an audiobook. When I read, I fall asleep unless I'm taking a test. And I'm just trying to get over as fast as possible. But as I was like reading it, listening to it, it was just like, what is this dude talking about? Like, what does this have to do with Apple and Martin Luther King? How are you deciding that you know that someone is doing something and why? So it was like, and then again, the title of the book and the title of that chapter, why, and then Assuming You Know, I assumed that I knew how this book was going to be presented, and it threw me for an entire loop as he started talking about how Apple and how Steve Jobs and how these people decided that they were going to do something and how they separated themselves from other people. And honestly, I'm still having trouble processing that because it's just not the way my mind normally works. I'm the type of person I pride myself on something, and it sucks for some people. It works for others. My wife, whatever, she loves it sometimes and sometimes she don't. But I pride myself on I don't do things I don't want to do. Like on a root level. And it's not like, hey, I don't feel like getting up. It's cold outside. I got a job. I got to go to work. I get it. I obligated myself to do something. I fulfill my obligations. But it's more like if somebody's like, hey, we're going to go over here and we're going to have a party. And I'm like, word, I'm going to go. And then I feel like I shouldn't go. I just be like, I'm not going. Whereas my wife, she might feel guilty about that. And so she'd be like, why are you just so able to do that? And I'm like, because really they wouldn't want me there if I wasn't going to have a good time anyway, right? Like
That's true.
That's how I rooted out. How did you process that?
So it's kind of interesting. First time, went over it, I guess. You don't process as much information. So I feel like I missed completely. I only resonated with what I was able to take from it the first time. So going over it again this time, it was very interesting. You presented the argument of Apple and it made me upset at first, right? The reason why I was upset was because I'm like, so one of the questions that I wrote on the page was, is this guy loving tech or is he just an Apple fanatic, right? And I was like, Apple this, Apple this, Apple this. I was like, I get the culture around Apple.
Yeah.
But having someone talk about it that way, it was just like rubbing it over and over and over in your face. But then I started looking at it from a different perspective. Like, what if I was an investor, like a person looking to build a business? What is it that I can take from these pages to build what I want? And so when I started looking at that, he gave some really cool tips, especially later on down in the 4 chapters when he says it's not the numbers, not the science that really like get to people. It's people resonate with who they are, what they believe in. Apple products is not about Apple, it's about the people themselves. And that right there, I was like, that one thing really hit me. If we were to pick based on those things alone, that we would be able to realize what's really going on with ourselves. So I was like, during that moment, I decided, I was like, hey, that's interesting. What if the next few things that I'm about to buy, I'm buying not for the technology or whatever science says it will bring, but for how it would resonate with who I am and what I want. And so I'm going to try that for the next couple of buys and then see where I can go from there.
I feel it. I was going to ask when you said, how did you mean to resonate with you? But I get it. I kind of looked at it the same way as I was like processing it. And I got to the point where as we go through it and we get to the 4th chapter, we start talking about how the advertising part was working. And it started going into like why people like certain things. I know for me, as a husband and a father with daughters, and sons don't really ask for as much, but daughters and wives ask for a lot. You know what I'm saying? Like they just want to sample stuff. Yeah. I don't know why that is, but it is. But in that point, assuming that like my wife will come and be like, hey, so I want this. Your kids be like, hey, can I buy this? I got money. I want to buy this game. And I'm like, what's the difference between that game and this game? Like, what are you buying this game for versus that game? And they look at you with this blank stare like, I just want to have a good time. And then that brings you to like many, many different things. But you said something that it stuck to me, but it didn't ring out because it's kind of one of those things that sit in the back of my head. But I don't know if you've ever read the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, where it describes people and how like people are naturally selfish and people like they have their own reason for doing things, and knowing why they're doing them will enable you to motivate them.
So I've not read that book. I've read How to Influence. I'd have to look back at the title, but I think it's influencing friends and
how to influence people and win friends or something like that.
Yeah, along that title. So no, and with that, right, that brought me to the question that I thought first. So when you were like, you assume or you ask that question, why this game over that game, I thought of how do we go about avoiding falsities, like avoiding that assumption, that piece of information that we think we know based off of a partial description. And later in this book, they talk about a former defense secretary, if I'm recalling that correctly. And she said she could make a decision on 30% of the information. She said anything upwards of 80 is too much. So how will you avoid falsities, like when it comes to like a family member?
I mean, that's a complicated question. I think it revolves around paying attention to people, though. Like everybody has habits, including yourself. I often reference Johari's window. You know, it's just like your inner child trying to figure out, but recognizing there's only so many ways that a thing could have happened. And people don't really go out of their way to be overly complex when they want something. You know what I'm saying? Like people, contrary to television, people don't sit down and concoct normal, like large plans just to get ice cream from their dad. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I'll clean my room. Hey, Dad, I cleaned my room. Can I have some ice cream? Hey, Dad, I did this. Can I go to the movies? Like it's more of an instant gratification thing. As you talk about how it becomes or how to steer away from falsities, I don't think there's an absolute way to do that. I think that it's kind of built in to the science of understanding somebody or something or why you're doing something. Because, I mean, there is no better lie than a lie that you tell yourself for why you're doing something. And it's kind of like when I was a WLC instructor, I would tell the students, like, I don't know if y'all recognize this, but y'all are all after the exact same thing, but you're fighting each other to get it. And they're like, what does that mean? Let's go to the whiteboard and just write this out. Who wants to be able to go home early? Who wants to be able to do this? And you write all these things out there like, yeah. And I'm like, what is that called? That's a thing. All of these things that you want to do, that you want to be able to leave when you want to be a sergeant major. Why do you want to be a sergeant major? Oh, because I want to be up there in front of formation. You want people to look up to you.
I never thought about that.
Why do you want to be able to go home when you want? What is that called? What is it called in combat? It's called initiative. It's a thing. You possess it. I want to be able to do what I want when I want. Why don't we all just live in the country? You know what I'm saying? Like we come in here, we get all these rules put on us, and then we have to figure out, assume you know, and then the thing that you know is that what does a soldier want at the end of the day? They want to know as much as possible so that they can make a decision, so they can go home and do what they want to do.
That is so true. For the people who don't understand though, could you like explain Johari's windows?
So Johari's window, and ironically, I learned this when I was an instructor as well. I don't even know how it came up, but Johari's window starts off. It's like a child looking through a pane of glass, and each one of them is like a farmer's window. So you got a 1, 2, 3, 4 quadrants of the window. Okay. And the first quadrant is the known known, what you know about yourself that other people also know.
Okay.
And then the second quadrant is what you know about yourself that no one else knows, like your little secrets that you keep when you go to the bathroom and you play on your phone in secret mode or whatever you do. And then the third one is the things that you don't know about yourself that other people know. And this is where, as an instructor with group psychology, you have to kind of focus because you have habits to distract yourself from doing other things like counting change in your pocket or how many steps you'll take walking forward and stuff like that. Like you create little patterns that you don't know that you're doing that tell people where your mind state is. And it distracts students. So they'll be like, oh, they'll start counting your steps and stuff like that. And so the fourth quadrant is the unknown because you're constantly evolving. As you start catching on to people catching on to you, then you start to change the behavior to stay more hidden, if that makes sense.
Okay.
The important thing about it is in front of the window is a child looking out. And it signifies, and I might be completely wrong about this, but when I look at it, it signifies we're all just trying to get back to being happy children where we don't have to worry about stuff. I think it was the Honorable Minister Farrakhan said it best. Like, in my mind, I'm just a little kid in the corner that wants to play with my marbles. I want there to be peace so that I can go sit down somewhere, and that's why he was doing everything that he does, is because he wants to have peace, but he can't have peace if everybody doesn't have it.
That's true.
And so, and it just ties into that. As a little kid, you're looking out the window, you think about all the stuff that you do and all the mentoring I've ever done. I tell people, like, you're the worst thing that you could ever be is an adult whose inner child is running around having a good time and you're not even paying attention to it. You don't have to be with every woman. You don't have to be with every man. You ain't got to drink every drink. That's just something that's sold to us. And that becomes like a larger, like, I'm tearing off from the subject. But that's the premise behind Jahari's window.
Led with that question because the next question that I had was very interesting, and it could be pushed out there to the broader view of life and how we see things versus how other people see things. But do you believe a single piece of information can change your life?
Absolutely. Me personally, I believe that because a single piece of information that is being withheld, once it's known, can release you if you're wanting to make the decision. And it's kind of like, I detest certain aspects of people when they like drive other people crazy by pretending, what they call it, gaslighting now. Narcissistic, like everybody else uses the word narcissistic and gaslighting. And so when you sit down and you look at it, it's like, okay, how did this chapter change? How did assuming that I know change my life? I decided what that book was about based on my experience with the word why. I made a decision. So when I read the first chapter, I don't know if I was like disappointed, but that piece of information, when I started reading, I was like, yo, what's he talking about Apple for? Like, what does this have to do? Like, I'm expecting a heartfelt explanation because of how I process information. And as I got that, as I started to receive it, it absolutely changed my life in that moment.
I think what was interesting about it is that it opened a perspective, an avenue that you didn't expect. You want to shoot one of your questions?
So right now, I want to know, like, what you think innovation stems from. And I'm going to tell you why I asked that question. It's because of how I processed that chapter. Obviously, he's using the way that he's speaking in a particular way. I think it's to remove emotion from it. But he had to think of a way to do that. He's being innovative with how he's communicating. Mm-hmm. And so how do you think that where does that stem from?
So, like, for me, when I think of something innovative, I think of something that will free me from something else, right? And so, for me, innovation basically is another way to break the mental rules that we have already placed on. It's just a way to get around it.
Regarding the book, though, it made a point that, assuming that you know, and the point where you was talking about it said something about Hitler versus JFK and how if you told their stories, they would be similar until you got to a certain point.
That is true.
How did you process that?
So that right there was interesting for me because, like, later on, the same book said that the things we feel aren't rational. So it depends on how you feel about Hitler versus JFK, right? Depending on, and again, like your perception of the person also paints the color of whether they were good or bad in history. Go figure, right? Each person has their own opinion. But the way I felt about them, so I didn't make the assumption. Because to be honest with you, I didn't particularly care for either of them. So when I saw the information, to me, it was just a new piece of information being introduced. And I was like, oh, this person's kind of cool. And then they was like, oh, yeah, Adolf Hitler. And I was like, wait, but everything that we were taught about that man is supposed to be bad, right?
Yeah.
And then I was like, huh. But then that's when new pieces of information mixes with old programming, which then like sparks new interest in a certain way.
And that's an interesting fact. I know taking, when you get your degree, you got to pass certain business classes and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And there's one I recall specifically being dumbfounded because when you talk about people, you don't necessarily talk about business in the same category, right? But they made a point to say it's not just the information that you received, it's also who you received it from. Like, there is a such thing as a non-reliable source of information. But at the end of the day, the way you process that information is based on the relationship that you have with that person or that entity. And so, like you said, when you looked at the information, I didn't feel any way about it until I got to the name, and then I was like, whoa, like, I thought he was a bad dude. Like, this doesn't sound bad. Like, it doesn't necessarily seem like an evil action. But again, it's who you are and how you're relating to the information, which I think is the most important. So then chapter 2 was carrots and sticks.
It's very funny because I think chapter 2, I summed it up was perspective versus perception. And the reason why I thought of it like that way was because I would think we know something, which is our perception of something versus the perspective. I know we had this conversation about a dot and seeing it from 360 degrees, which took me back to a high school class where someone was like, oh yeah, it's innovation versus this, that, and a third, which I thought was bullshit at the time and still don't think it's bullshit. Because, like I said, I defined innovation, what it meant to me at this time and moment. And at that time, I still didn't know what innovation was. So I thought they were trying to teach me a bunch of bullshit. What did you think about chapter 2?
So this is funny because this reminds me of like manipulation versus inspiration. For everyone who's reading the book, you know that's like the premise under chapter 2, right? And so what happened with me was I was in Iraq. And I was in charge of my section to a certain extent. I had an E6 who was above me. I'm not going to name names in this moment because that story gets complicated. But I had an E6 who was above me, and then there was me, and I had like 4 or 5 more soldiers. Pearson, Lane, Brienne, and Bristol was 4 directly under me. And so we got to a point where we had been in the country. We got everything established, ran all this fiber and stuff. And so I was like, hey, we need to take time to sit back and then like let everybody else be in charge so they can understand, you know what I'm saying, like the function of what a leader's supposed to be doing and how to function, and then and we'll just do a recap and go through stuff. So we would just create like scenarios and give them problems, but they would be in charge like, hey, we're gonna go wire this building. So that person would have to go out, look at the building, figure out how he's gonna do it, because we're talking about nailing, concrete nails into the wall and zip ties. It was very rudimentary. We didn't have a lot of equipment. OIF2, like it was weird, but it was fun. And so it was Martin's turn, female. And so she goes in to the building. She comes up with the plan. We sit down, we talk about it, we hash it all out. And then Bristol came and he had turned his uniforms in to get some stuff sewn on, so he was seamstress, right? And so he comes to her before noon chow and he was like, hey, will I have time to go and get my uniform? And she said, I don't know, maybe, we'll see. So Roger, he walks off. He comes back 20 minutes later. Hey, did you figure out whether I was going to be able to get my uniform tonight? And it's a funny scenario, right? Because when you sit back, he was intent on doing something and she was intent on doing something else, right? But her idea, which we later discussed, was that she was going to manipulate him into work instead of inspiring him to work. And the way she was doing that was leveraging his desire to go get his uniforms to get him to perform. But he kept coming back every 20 minutes. So we're sitting there and I'm just dying laughing because everybody's always like, oh, this is when I was an E5. It's like, oh, you're so mean, you're so cut, you're so dry, you just da-da-da-da-da-da. I was brought up in the Marine Corps, so it was different. Somebody asks you a question, the answer is always no. It's always no. It doesn't matter. Somebody could, hey, sorry, can I go get my uniforms? No, we don't have time. You need to get back to work. Forget about your uniforms. They're not going anywhere. Go back to work. Hey, we got done early. Hey, take off. Go get your uniforms, man. Hey, good job. He appreciates that. But it's like, you know what I'm saying, when we read that book, The Way to Superior Man, where I was telling you, like, when you go home to your wife, hey, when you go home to your wife, don't be thinking about work. If you're going to think about work, stay at work. Go home to your wife and then be with your wife. Don't go home to your wife thinking about work. If she's going to be mad, you'd rather her be mad about that than you getting home and she's talking to you and you're not listening because you haven't finished working. Piece of advice, I'm shutting up now. But it was crazy because when sitting down talking to her about it, in her mind, the way she processed, she's like, I wanted him to focus on working, so I told him maybe because I didn't want him to be upset with me. I didn't want him to be mad and stop working. And I was like, so you tried to trick him. And he was like intent, he wanted his uniform. But she never asked why he was so intent on getting a uniform. She just kept him telling the same thing. I don't know. And send him away. I don't know. And send him away. Same thing happened with lunch. Hey, what are we doing for chow? And she was like, well, what do y'all want to do? And everybody just stood there and looked at her like, well, he was like, well, I want to go get my uniforms. We don't have time for that. We need to work through chow. So then why ask us what we want to do?
Wait, she said, so that don't make no sense though.
It made absolute sense to her because her intent was different than my intent. She wanted everybody happy. Her way to get everybody to be happy was to try to give them what they wanted. My way of making everybody happy was to free them from the obligation so they can go be happy. If we finish the job, everybody can leave. But if you're not focused on the job, are you going to finish it?
No.
She was like, if I just get them to want to finish the job, then they'll leave. Then we can go.
Mm-hmm.
But now everybody's sitting there daydreaming about what else they want to go do. And so that like really stuck out to me when I read that. And this whole chapter is about businesses trying to trick people into buying their stuff and how it always only works for a little while. The equivalent of the example with Samsung, where he was like, Samsung said that you can only get the rebate if it goes to a different address. So, but they labeled the entire apartment building as the one address. Yeah. And I was like, but it didn't work. They still ended up paying the money. It only got them money for a little while. Granted, they made interest off the money and stuff like that. But what did they gain from that? Hopefully they learned, you know what I'm saying? They didn't do it again. But then everybody else was like, that's a shady business practice because they ended up getting sued to get their money.
That's true.
Because their manipulation only gonna work for so long. You can only that fool to some of the people for so long that I don't know. Yeah. No, it's not fool me once. It's like you can't fool all the people all the time. It's some we'll look it up here soon. I'm looking it up on my phone. What did you gather from that?